There is a rock bottom, and then there is the basement beneath it. For me, the basement was the afternoon I was so heavily sedated on narcotics that I hallucinated my own mother was a stranger. I was in my early 20s, living in a small province in Vietnam. Well, it wasn't that small, but it felt suffocating back then. I had been dabbling in heavy substances for a while, mostly smoking, thinking I had it under control. But the day I finally picked up a needle and shot up in my childhood bedroom, my mother walked in. I was so high, so disconnected from reality, that when she dropped to her knees on the floor, weeping and begging me to stop, I just stared at her blankly. I didn't even recognize the woman who gave birth to me. That afternoon, out of pure, desperate love, my parents called the authorities. They didn't want me in prison. They wanted me to live. By sunset, I was loaded into a van and shipped off to a provincial drug rehabilitation center. This was back in 2003. At that time, localized rehab centers were a relatively new concept in the country. They weren't modern medical facilities. They were grim, concrete compounds surrounded by high walls and coils of razor wire. Because it was my first time injecting, the wardens figured my blood wasn't too deeply poisoned yet. They sentenced me to 4 days in the cutoff room. It was pure crap. The cutoff room was exactly what it sounded like. It was a solitary confinement cell designed for one purpose: to let you ride out the agonizing, violent storm of acute withdrawal entirely alone. It was a small concrete box with a heavy door, a drain in the floor, and a thin mat that smelled like mold and old sweat. The first night was an absolute nightmare. If you've never experienced severe chemical withdrawal, I pray you never do. It isn't just sweating and shaking. It feels like your own skeleton is trying to tear its way out of your muscles. Like, it's just this freaking excruciating pain. I lay on the floor, curled into a tight ball, thrashing violently. My brain was misfiring, generating these horrific phantom sensations. I vividly felt thousands of invisible maggots burrowing under my skin, crawling through my veins. I bit my pillow so hard I tore the fabric to shreds, my mouth full of cheap synthetic cotton, just to keep myself from screaming. By the second night, the agony peaked. I was lying on the damp concrete, completely exhausted, drowning in a fever dream. That is when I felt the touch. It was soft, cool, a small hand gently stroking my burning cheek. I cracked my eyes open. The cell was pitch black, but my eyes had adjusted enough to see her. Sitting right beside me on the floor was a young woman. She was wearing the exact same blue, coarse uniform as the male inmates. Her hair was long, messy, and draped over her shoulders. She looked pale, her face slightly sunken, bearing the unmistakable signs of a heavy user. But to me, in that moment of absolute torture, she looked like an angel. She whispered to me, telling me to just breathe and hold it in. Her voice was incredibly soft, almost like a lullaby, as she told me not to scratch myself because I would bleed, promising that it was going to pass. She gently pulled my hands away from my chest, stopping me from clawing my own skin off. Now, a rational person would have jumped up and screamed. I was in a locked, solitary cell in a men's facility. There was zero possibility of a woman being in there. But when your brain is literally breaking down from withdrawal, logic simply does not exist. I thought my mind had finally fractured, creating a phantom nurse to comfort me as I died. I didn't care if she was an illusion. I just wanted the pain to stop. For the next 3 nights, she was there. Whenever the violent tremors hit, whenever the invisible bugs started crawling, she would materialize in the dark. She would lay my head in her lap, stroke my hair, rub my ears, and murmur quiet, soothing words until the spasms passed and I drifted into a heavy, exhausted sleep. By the morning of the 5th day, the worst of the physical dependency had burned out of my system. The heavy metal door swung open, and a warden pulled me out. He asked me how I was feeling. I was groggy, but the agonizing cramps were gone. As we walked down the outdoor corridor toward the general population dorms, I turned to the warden and asked him what the name of the girl they sent in to help me was. The warden stopped walking. He looked at me, his brow furrowed, and demanded to know what girl I was talking about. I told him about the girl in the blue uniform, explaining how she sat with me the last few nights and helped me breathe through the cramps, and that I just wanted to buy her a coffee or something to say thank you. The warden let out a harsh laugh and completely laid into me, asking if I was out of my mind. He bluntly reminded me that this was a men's compound and mocked the idea that they would lock female inmates in solitary confinement with heavily withdrawing men. He told me I was just hallucinating because the drugs were leaving my brain and ordered me to keep moving. I nodded slowly. It made perfect sense. It was just a coping mechanism, fabricated by a desperate mind. I was moved into a large, rectangular concrete room. It housed 8 men. Instead of individual beds, there was one massive, elevated concrete slab, a traditional platform bed that spanned the length of the room. We all slept shoulder to shoulder on it. That evening, the vibe was surprisingly relaxed. We had just finished dinner. The other 7 guys were clustered at the far end of the room, sitting around a tiny, static-filled television watching a soccer match. I was too exhausted to socialize. I took the spot at the complete opposite end of the concrete slab, right next to the open doorway of the ensuite bathroom. The bathroom was just a damp, windowless stall with a bucket and a hole in the ground. I lay down on my back, closing my eyes, listening to the muffled cheers of the soccer game. And then I heard the singing. It was coming from inside the dark bathroom, inches from my head. It was a woman's voice. She was humming a popular Vietnamese pop song from the late 90s. The melody was slow, melancholic, and incredibly clear. My eyes snapped open. I lay perfectly still. The singing stopped. A voice echoed from the wet tiles of the bathroom stall. "Do you think I sing well?" Staring at the ceiling, I mumbled out loud that she sang beautifully and that she should be a singer when she got released. Suddenly, one of the guys at the other end of the room paused the TV and yelled out, asking who the hell I was talking to. I sat up and pointed at the dark doorway, telling them about the girl in the bathroom who was just singing. All 7 men stared at me. The room went dead silent. One of them sighed, shaking his head, and told me I was seriously fried. He swore there was nobody in that damn bathroom, and that I just had the wet brain, telling me to just go to sleep. I got off the slab, walked to the bathroom, and peeked inside. It was completely empty. I crawled back onto my corner of the concrete platform, thoroughly disturbed. I convinced myself they were right. I was just having lingering audio hallucinations. The withdrawal was playing tricks on me. I crossed my arms over my chest, closed my eyes, and tried to force myself to sleep. About an hour later, the room was quiet. The TV was off. I cracked my eyes open, and my heart completely stopped in my chest. She wasn't in the bathroom. She was sitting at the far corner of the room, about 20 feet away. It was the same girl. The messy hair, the blue uniform, but she wasn't looking at me with pity anymore. She was sitting on the floor with one leg tucked under her and the other knee raised to her chest. She was resting her chin on her knee, staring directly at me, and she was smiling. My voice trembling, I desperately whispered to the guys to wake up and tell me I was hallucinating, pleading with them that she was sitting right there. None of the 7 men moved. It was like they were completely deaf. I watched in absolute paralyzing horror as the woman uncrossed her legs and dropped to all fours. She started crawling toward me. She moved like an insect, her joints popping silently as she dragged herself across the concrete floor, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, never breaking eye contact, never dropping that rigid, terrifying smile. I wanted to scream, but my brain kept telling me, "It's an hallucination. It's not real. Don't embarrass yourself. Just wait for it to fade." She reached the edge of the concrete slab. She crawled right up onto the platform. She hovered directly over my body. And then, she sat down. She dropped her full physical weight directly onto my chest. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. Holy fuck. She crossed her legs in a lotus position while sitting on me. But because of the angle, the hard, bony edge of her shin pressed directly into my throat. She leaned forward, her face inches from mine. She was giggling quietly. Hee hee, hee hee. The pressure on my windpipe was excruciating. I tried to thrash, tried to push her off, but my arms wouldn't move. I was completely pinned beneath a massive freezing weight. I was absolutely fucking terrified. She wasn't crushing my trachea completely. She was applying just enough pressure to let a tiny, agonizing sliver of oxygen through, just enough to keep my heart beating, just enough to keep me perfectly conscious while I slowly suffocated. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring into her dead, smiling eyes, gasping for microscopic breaths, until my brain finally starved of oxygen and everything faded to black. I woke up hours later under the harsh, blinding fluorescent lights of the facility's medical clinic. The camp doctor was standing over me, shining a penlight into my eyes. 2 wardens were standing by the door. The doctor calmly informed me that I had a severe seizure in my sleep and that my bunkmates carried me in there. He then asked me to tell him exactly what I felt before I lost consciousness. I was terrified they were going to put me in a straitjacket, but the near-death experience broke me. I started crying and babbled about the girl from the solitary cell, desperately explaining how she had followed me, crawled onto my chest, and pinned my throat with her leg, swearing to God that I couldn't breathe. One of the wardens rolled his eyes and started to scold me for making up ghost stories, but the doctor raised his hand, silencing the guard. The doctor ordered the wardens to wait outside so he could evaluate me privately. Once the heavy clinic door clicked shut, the doctor pulled up a metal chair and sat down next to my bed. He looked incredibly tired. The doctor quietly told me he was going to give me a heavy sedative so I would sleep there tonight, promising that tomorrow I would not see her again. He then asked if I knew why. I shook my head, my throat still throbbing. He told me it was because she only tortures the ones who think she isn't real. The doctor leaned in closer. He told me the dark history of the compound. A few years prior, when the facility first opened, it was actually a women's rehabilitation center. 2 female inmates, going through intense withdrawal, decided they couldn't take it anymore. In the middle of the night, they attempted to scale the perimeter wall. One woman hoisted the other up. But when the spotlights hit them, the woman on top panicked. To save herself, she kicked her friend directly in the chest, sending her plummeting back down to the concrete courtyard. The betrayed woman, whose name was Mai, fell awkwardly. Her leg scraped against a jagged piece of broken glass cemented into the lower wall. It ripped a massive, deep laceration across her calf. The guards caught Mai. The doctors stitched up her leg, but as punishment for the escape attempt, and to force her through the detox, they threw her into the cut-off room. The doctor looked at the floor, his voice thick with guilt, and confessed that he had underestimated her psychological break. He explained how acute chemical withdrawal magnified everything 100 times, where a mosquito bite felt like a knife and a headache felt like a gunshot. He described how she was trapped in solitary, dealing with the agonizing withdrawal, the searing pain of a deep flesh wound, and the utter despair of being betrayed by her only friend. Sometime during the 3rd night, Mai lost her mind. The guards heard a rhythmic, violent thudding coming from the solitary cell. When they unlocked the door, they found Mai lying in a pool of blood. Driven completely insane by the pain, she had repeatedly slammed her own head against the concrete wall. She hit the wall with such horrifying, relentless force that she had actually cracked her own skull open. She died on the floor before the doctor could even stabilize her. They eventually moved the women to a different facility and turned this one into a men's camp. But Mai never left. The doctor whispered that she appears to the men in the solitary cell because she remembers the pain and that she comforts you. But, he warned, when you get out and dismiss her as a hallucination or a trick of a broken brain, it enrages her because it invalidates her existence. That was why she crawls onto your chest and crushes your throat, to force you to feel how real she is. The doctor stood up and prepared a syringe, telling me all this because the rules of this haunting were very specific. He assured me that once I knew her story and accepted that she was a dead woman and not a hallucination, she would lose her reason to punish me and finally leave me alone. He injected the sedative into my IV. I passed out within minutes. When I woke up the next morning, The crushing weight in the room was gone. I spent the rest of my time at the facility, got clean, and eventually returned to society. It's been over 20 years. I'm an older man now, and I've stayed entirely sober. But the memory of that concrete room has never left me. People love to say that drug addicts see demons because the chemicals break their brains. But I know the terrifying truth. The chemicals don't create the demons. They just force your eyes open wide enough to see the ones that are already sitting in the room with you. Look, I gotta be honest with you right out of the gate. When you grow up dirt poor in a developing country, the concept of being scared of the dark is a luxury you really can't afford. You're too busy being terrified of the landlord, or the medical bills, or the fact that your dad's motorbike just broke down again. I was about 9 years old back in 2006. My parents were factory workers in Saigon, living paycheck to paycheck. We rented a room in this massive, sprawling boarding house complex. If you've never been in one of these places, picture a long, concrete tunnel sliced up into tiny windowless concrete boxes. The roof was made of cheap corrugated tin. During the dry season, the room was a literal oven. You'd just lie there on a thin bamboo mat, sweating, listening to the industrial fan rattling on the ceiling, sounding like a helicopter engine about to give out. That rattling, the distant hum of traffic, the smell of cheap instant noodles and damp mildew, that was my lullaby. My mom had this childhood friend, let's call her Tessa. Truth be told, Tessa was a complete train wreck. While my parents busted their asses to put food on the table, Tessa was heavily addicted to underground lottery rings. She was always dodging debt collectors, always getting into screaming matches with her husband, and always showing up at our door with a sob story. My dad couldn't stand her. He used to say she was a sinking ship, trying to drag everyone down with her. But my mom had a soft spot for her. So, every few months, Tessa would show up, sleep on our floor for a few days, borrow some cash, and vanish again. Anyway, fast forward a bit. My parents managed to move us to a slightly bigger boarding house, closer to the factory. It had 3 long rows of rooms, facing each other. But there was a heavy, suffocating vibe to this new place. You see, a few months before we moved in, there was an incident. At the very end of the row next to ours, there was a woman in her early 30s. She was a factory worker on paper, but everyone knew she made her real money stringing along lonely, desperate men. She was flashy. She always wore thick, heavy gold chains and bracelets. Back then, working-class folks didn't use banks. You wore your savings. Well, one of the guys she scammed got bitter. He hired some local junkies to rob her. They broke into her room in the dead of night. Things went wrong. She fought back. They ended up cutting her throat. By the time the neighbors heard the muffled struggling and forced the door open, the guys were gone, and she was bleeding out on the cheap linoleum floor. She died right there, clutching her neck. Lord have mercy. The whole complex was traumatized. The police came, did their thing, and left. But nobody wanted to rent that room. The landlord just locked it up. All of her stuff, her clothes, her cheap makeup, her gas stove, her dirty dishes, was left exactly as it was. It just sat there, gathering thick layers of dust in the dark. A dead woman's shrine at the end of a dark, narrow hallway. So, that brings us to the night it all happened. It was late 2007. Tessa called my mom around 5 p.m. She was crying, saying she was finally leaving her abusive husband. She had her 2-year-old daughter, Nora, with her. She was catching a bus to the city. Well, I think she said it was a bus. Honestly, I don't even know how she afforded it back then, and begged to crash at our place. My mom, feeling trapped, sighed and said yes. She told Tessa to call when she reached the main road, and my dad would walk out to the alley entrance to guide her in. Here's the thing about exhaustion. It makes you careless. My dad had been drinking cheap rice wine with his buddies that evening. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, he was completely blackout drunk, snoring on the floor mat. My mom, exhausted from a 12-hour shift, drifted off to sleep too, assuming my dad would wake up when the phone rang. The clock hit 12:30 a.m. My mom jolted awake. The room was dark, save for the orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the cracks in the door. My dad was still passed out, drooling on his pillow. Tessa wasn't here. Panic setting in, my mom grabbed her cheap Nokia phone and dialed Tessa's number. Tessa picked up on the second ring, sounding completely irritated, and hushed, snapping at my mom that she was already inside our room. My mom blinked in the dark, her confusion spiking as she demanded to know what Tessa was talking about and where she actually was, since my dad was fast asleep right next to her. Tessa whispered back that she was up on our loft trying to get Nora to sleep, complaining about why my mom hadn't bothered to turn the light on for her. A freezing chill shot down my mom's spine. Our room didn't have a loft. My mom's voice trembled as she forced the words out, explicitly stating that we didn't even have a loft, and begging to know where the hell Tessa had gone. Silence on the other end. Then, the sound of the 2-year-old toddler, Nora, starting to whimper. Through the phone speaker, my mom heard the little girl's voice, completely muffled and terrified, whimpering about how the lady was bleeding and how the lady was hugging her. My mom's stomach dropped as she practically screamed into the receiver, telling Tessa to get out of there immediately and frantically asking which room she had wandered into. Tessa stammered back, panic finally bleeding into her voice as she frantically explained she didn't know, that she couldn't open the door and had put Nora down for just 1 single second to pull the handle, and now the kid was somehow up on the loft. She could hear her crying up there while the lights wouldn't even work. My mom hung up, kicked my dad awake, and dragged him out the door. I stayed behind, huddled under my thin blanket, absolutely paralyzed. They ran down the dirt path connecting the rows of rooms. The night air was thick and humid, smelling strongly of rotting garbage and stagnant water. As they turned the corner to the next row, they heard it, the echoing, frantic cries of a toddler coming from the very last room in the hallway, room 12, the dead woman's room. When they reached the door, my dad didn't kick it. He didn't even have to force it. He just placed his hand on the rotting wood and pushed gently. It swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak, opening into complete, suffocating darkness. And right at that exact moment, with my parents' hearts threatening to explode out of their chests, my dad later told me his eyes locked onto this single, rusty nail jutting out of the doorframe. A tiny piece of blue plastic caught on it, fluttering slightly in the stagnant air, and he just stared at it, completely hyper-fixated on this meaningless trash, because his brain just absolutely refused to process the fucking nightmare waiting inside. There was no screaming, just a heavy, paralyzing silence that sucked the air out of your lungs. The smell of old, dried copper and deep mildew hit them like a physical wall. Tessa was kneeling on the floor, clutching Nora to her chest, trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. They grabbed her by the arms and pulled her out, speed-walking back to our room without looking back. Once we were all locked inside, sitting under the harsh fluorescent light, Tessa finally broke down and explained what happened. She had arrived at the main road around midnight. When she got off the motorbike taxi, she saw a woman in pajamas standing at the entrance of the dark alley, waving her over. Tessa, exhausted and carrying a heavy toddler, just assumed it was my mom. She followed the figure into the pitch-black alley. The woman never spoke. She just walked with this stiff, jerky motion, her head tilted at an angle that looked wrong, like her neck couldn't support the weight of her skull. Tessa followed her all the way to the last room. The door was already open. The woman pointed up to the loft, and Tessa, feeling awkward and not wanting to be a burden, just walked in and climbed up. But as Tessa lay there in the dark, she realized the woman hadn't gone to sleep. For over 40 minutes, Tessa watched a shadowy silhouette move around the tiny room below. It was doing chores in the pitch black. She heard the agonizing sound of a broom scraping relentlessly against the raw concrete just this sickening, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape that made her skin crawl, before the sudden, jarring noise of the toilet flushing and the dusty clinking of old bowls. It wasn't until my mom called that Tessa realized she was in the wrong place. When she tried to leave, the wooden door wouldn't budge. It was like it was cemented shut. She set Nora down to use both hands. In the blink of an eye, the toddler was gone from her feet. Nora had been silently lifted and placed on the loft above, then into the bathroom, then under the sink. The unseen thing was playing with her in the dark. I was sitting on the bed, listening to this, feeling like I was going to throw up. My parents told Tessa to shut up and just try to sleep. We laid out a mat on the floor, 5 people crammed into a space meant for 2. It was maybe 15 minutes later. The room was dead silent except for the rattling ceiling fan. Suddenly, little Nora, who was tucked under Tessa's arm, pulled her blanket down. She raised her tiny chubby finger and pointed directly at the dark corner of our ceiling. Nora whispered in this totally flat, dead voice that the lady was up there, smiling at her, and that she had so much gold. Holy fucking shit. I stopped breathing. My dad squeezed his eyes shut and started silently reciting Buddhist prayers in his head. None of us moved. None of us looked up. Out in the hallway, the heavy wooden door of room 12 began to creak. Creak, slam, creak, slam, like someone was slowly swinging it back and forth in the dead of night. We stayed frozen in sleep paralysis for what felt like years. Eventually, out of sheer mental exhaustion, we passed out. The next morning, the sunlight was blinding. We woke up, our bodies aching from the hard floor. My mom sat up first. Then she let out a gasp that made my blood run cold. Nora was gone. Our front door was still deadbolted from the inside. The key was sitting on the table. There was physically no way for a 2-year-old to unlock a heavy metal padlock and walk out. My parents and Tessa didn't even speak. They just bolted out the door and sprinted to the next row of rooms. Room 12 was wide open. They rushed in, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, Nora was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the dusty floor. She wasn't crying. She was giggling, playing with something shiny in the dirt. My mom scooped her up, checking her frantically for injuries. Nora just smiled and held out her hand. Resting in her small palm was a heavy, 24-karat gold ring. Nora happily mumbled that the lady had given it to her, adding that the strange woman had told her she could stay and play with her forever. It must have fallen off during the robbery, rolled into a crack in the floorboards. The restless spirit of that murdered woman, a woman who had left her own child in the countryside to come work in the city, had found it, and she wanted to trade it for Nora. My parents begged Tessa to leave the ring on the smoke-stained wooden altar they had set up in the corner of the room. They told her to buy some fruit, set out small bowls of rice and salt, and apologize to the spirit. But I gotta tell you, human greed is a terrifying thing. Tessa saw a way out of her debts. While my parents were distracted, she pocketed that ring, packed her bags, and left with Nora before noon. She didn't even say goodbye. We thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, my mom's phone rang. It was Tessa, calling from a provincial hospital miles away. She was hysterical. Nora was dying. The little girl had been running a 104-degree fever for a week. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she would start talking to the lady with the gold, begging to go back to the boarding house. She was fading fast. Tessa had sold the ring the very same day she left. She paid off her gambling debts and spent the rest. She had nothing left to pay the hospital bills. My parents, despite everything, drove out there, paid the medical fees, and forced Tessa to go to a local temple to get a monk to intervene. I don't know what kind of rituals they did, but eventually, the fever broke. The spirit let go. Or maybe she just realized Nora wasn't hers to keep. Tessa took her kid and moved far away up north. We never saw her again. My family packed up our things and moved to a different district a month later. The landlord eventually demolished that entire row of rooms because nobody, not even the most desperate migrant workers, would rent anywhere near room 12. What the hell was Tessa thinking? Taking gold from a dead woman. I was young, broke, and growing up in a shithole, but even I knew you don't mess with the dead. I was young, broke, and incredibly stupid. You can call me an idiot, and honestly, I'd probably agree with you. When you're in your early 20s, just married, with barely 2 coins to rub together, you don't really think about consequences. You just think about survival. This was back in 1988. Actually, wait. No, it must have been early 89. My wife Delilah and I had just tied the knot. We were living in a tiny, suffocating room down in the city. The kind of place where the tin roof turns into an oven by noon and the air feels thick enough to chew. I was scraping by doing day labor, mixing cement, hauling bricks, whatever paid enough to keep a bowl of rice on the table. But it wasn't enough. We wanted kids eventually. We wanted a real life. Then, one afternoon, this government contractor came sniffing around our neighborhood. He was looking for able-bodied men to head deep into the Central Highlands, out into the absolute middle of nowhere, to clear out a massive section of virgin forest. They were building a dam or a reservoir or something. I didn't care about the logistics. I only cared about the numbers. Here's the thing about that job. The pay was completely unhinged. They were offering what amounted to maybe $150 a month. Now, that might sound like pocket change today, but back then, in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, that was a fortune. Working 1 month out in that jungle was the equivalent of busting my ass for half a year back home. You do 2 months out there, you come back and you build a house. You buy a motorcycle. You set yourself up. But there was a catch. There's always a catch, isn't there? The job was completely off the grid, hundreds of miles away from civilization. Once you went in, you didn't come out for a month. A lot of the local guys backed out. They were scared of getting scammed, or getting malaria, or just disappearing into the woods. But Delilah and I looked at each other. We saw a way out of the dirt. They needed a cook, someone to handle the meals for a crew of about 20 roughneck loggers. Delilah volunteered. The contractor promised that if she could handle feeding 20 hungry men by herself in the middle of a malaria-infested jungle, she'd get time and a half. So we packed our meager belongings and got on a military transport truck. The ride took hours. We drove until the paved roads turned to dirt, and the dirt roads turned to mud, and the mud just faded into a wall of towering ancient trees. The air out there was different. It didn't feel like the city. It felt heavy, damp. It smelled like rotting leaves and wet earth, a smell that just clung to the inside of your nose. When we finally arrived at the site, the setup was as basic as it gets. It wasn't even a cabin. It was just a massive thatched roof, hoisted up on thick wooden poles. No walls, just open air. Inside there were cots and mosquito nets strung up everywhere. A crude fire pit for Delilah to cook on. No electricity, obviously. When the sun went down, our entire world shrank to whatever the dim yellow glow of a kerosene lamp could touch. Beyond that was just a wall of absolute, suffocating darkness. For the first few days, the routine was grueling, but normal. The camp woke up at dawn to the sound of a heavy metal pipe banging against an empty gas cylinder. We'd hike about a mile deep into the dense brush to the actual logging site, swing axes and run 2-man saws until our hands bled, hike back for lunch, and then do it all over again, until dusk. Delilah was the only woman for miles. It was a tough spot to be in, but she held her own. She was tough as nails. Anyway, about 4 or 5 days into the job, the foreman decided to boost morale. He had hitched a ride to a nearby village and brought back a massive plastic jug of cheap rice wine. And I mean, the really strong, throat-burning stuff. The guys had been setting snare traps in the brush around the camp, and the jungle was crawling with wildlife. They caught wild boar, civets, you name it. There was so much meat we couldn't even eat it all. So, that night, Delilah roasted up a massive spread of wild game, and the entire crew sat around the dirt floor, drinking and eating like kings. I'm not gonna lie, I drank a lot that night. The exhaustion in my bones just soaked up the alcohol. By 10 o'clock, the camp was dead quiet. Men were passed out in their hammocks and cots, snoring heavily. I crawled into bed next to Delilah, the smell of cheap wine and wood smoke clinging to my skin, and I was out cold the second my head hit the makeshift pillow. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. You don't really track time out there, but the air had that freezing, damp chill that only happens in the dead of night, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. My head was pounding, a dull, rhythmic throb right behind my eyes. I heard voices. I heard several hushed, overlapping voices, urgently whispering for Callum, which is me, to wake up. I groaned, rubbing my eyes. The camp was pitch black. The kerosene lamps had all been snuffed out to save fuel. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. They were urgently hissing at me to get moving, promising a big job and big money if I hurried. I slowly sat up, my head swimming. I squinted into the dark and saw the silhouettes of about 5 or 6 men standing just outside the edge of the shelter. They were holding what looked like machetes and axes. In my drunken, sleep-addled brain, I just figured it was the crew. Out here, a lot of the guys were desperate. Sometimes, if they found a massive, valuable hardwood tree, they'd go out in the middle of the night to cut it down illegally and hide it from the government contractor to sell on the black market. It was highly illegal and dangerous, but it happened. I mumbled something about it being the middle of the freaking night and asked what the hell they were doing. They just shushed me, insisting I keep quiet and follow them. I didn't want to miss out on extra cash, so I slipped on my heavy rubber sandals, the cheap kind made from old tire treads, and stumbled out into the damp grass, following them into the tree line. We walked. The canopy above was so thick that the moonlight barely penetrated. It just fell in pale grayish slivers across the forest floor. I was trudging behind them, still half asleep, shivering in the humid night air. After about 15 minutes, my head started to clear just a little bit. And as the fog of the alcohol lifted, a cold, creeping sense of unease settled in my stomach. Something was wrong. The path we were taking, it wasn't the trail we used to get to the logging site. We were veering way off to the right, pushing deeper into the untouched, overgrown part of the forest. Stepping over a massive rotting log, I tried to whisper to them, asking if we were even going the right way since the logging site was supposed to be back toward the river. No one answered. The guy directly in front of me just kept walking. I looked closer at him. He was wearing the standard issue floppy canvas hat that most of us wore, his shoulders hunched. But here is the thing that makes my stomach turn even now, decades later. We were in dense, untouched jungle. The ground was littered with dry leaves, snapping twigs, and thorny vines. Every step I took sounded like a firecracker going off. Crunch, snap, rustle. The 5 men in front of me weren't making a sound. It didn't make sense. It was completely illogical. They weren't swinging their machetes to clear the brush. They weren't tripping over roots. They were just gliding, moving through the dense foliage as smoothly as if they were walking down a paved sidewalk. My heart was starting to thud against my ribs, so I raised my voice a little, demanding to know who the hell they were and where they were taking me. We passed through a small clearing where the moonlight pooled brightly on the ground. I sped up, forcing myself alongside the man in the front. I grabbed his shoulder to turn him around. He didn't stop walking. He just turned his head to look at me. His face was wrong. It was smooth in the moonlight, lacking definition, like clay that hadn't been fully molded. But his eyes were wide open, unblinking, and staring dead ahead. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. And right then, instead of focusing on the fact that he literally had no facial features, my panic-stricken brain just locked onto the frayed hem of his canvas jacket. This one loose, dirty yellow thread just swaying back and forth in the breeze, and I just stared at that stupid thread like it was the most important thing in the universe. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat. The 5 men kept walking. They didn't slow down. They didn't acknowledge that I had stopped. I stood there, paralyzed, the chill of the jungle seeping deep into my bones, watching them walk further and further into the brush. And then, one by one, they just faded. The shadows of the trees seemed to swallow them whole. No sound, no rustling leaves, just gone. Absolute, deafening silence. I was completely alone in the middle of an uncharted jungle, miles from camp, in the pitch black. Panic hit me like a physical blow. A sudden, terrifying thought flashed through my mind. What if this was a trick? What if some of the sketchy guys at the camp had lured me out here so they could circle back and get to Delilah? She was the only woman for miles. I turned around and started running. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I sprinted blindly through the dark, tearing through thorny bushes that ripped at my clothes and skin. I was hyperventilating, the thick, humid air burning my lungs. I tried to follow my own crushed footprints, praying to whatever was listening that I wouldn't get lost. I ran until one of my heavy rubber sandals caught on a root and snapped clean in half. I didn't stop. I ran barefoot. Sharp rocks and thorns sliced deep into the soles of my feet, sending shooting pain up my legs, but the adrenaline numbed it. It took me over 2 hours to find my way back. By the time I saw the dim outline of the camp's thatched roof against the slightly lightening sky, it was almost 4 in the morning. I burst into the camp, my feet covered in mud and blood, my chest heaving. I grabbed a machete from the tool pile and started screaming, ready to kill whoever had lured me out. The guys woke up, terrified, stumbling out of their nets. Delilah rushed over to me, grabbing my arms and frantically asking what had happened and if I was okay. I looked around frantically. Everyone was there. Everyone was groggy, hungover, and completely confused. No one had left the camp. No one had been awake. I dropped the machete, my hands shaking violently. I didn't say a word. I just let Delilah wrap my bleeding feet. I convinced myself I was just crazy, that the alcohol had given me some kind of waking nightmare. I shoved it down. I needed the money too badly to quit over a bad dream. I should have listened to my gut. 2 weeks later, the jungle proved me wrong. It was late afternoon, around 5:30. The sky was bruising into a deep, hazy purple. The crew was finishing up for the day, packing the heavy timber onto a massive transport truck that had driven up the dirt path. Suddenly, the sky opened up. A torrential downpour turned the ground into a river of thick, slick mud. The transport truck, loaded with tons of fresh-cut logs, tried to reverse out of the sight and immediately sank into a deep trench. The tires spun uselessly, spraying mud everywhere. It was stuck fast. The foreman was furious. He yelled over the storm for Delilah to head back to camp, telling her we were going to be stuck there for hours and ordering her to whip up something hot for the guys to eat by the time we dragged ourselves back. Delilah nodded, wrapped a plastic tarp around her shoulders, and trekked the mile back to the empty camp. By the time she got there, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity. The camp was dead quiet, save for the dripping of water from the leaves. She was exhausted. Her bones ached from weeks of sleeping on wooden planks. She quickly chopped up some salted pork, threw it in a massive iron wok with some wild vegetables, and steamed a huge vat of rice. It took her about an hour. By 7:30, the food was done. The smell of rich, savory pork filled the damp air. She scooped everything into large serving bowls, covered them with woven bamboo lids to keep the flies away, and set them on the long wooden dining table. She sat down on a nearby cot, leaning her head against the wooden post. She figured she'd just rest her eyes for a minute while she waited for us to return. She drifted off. About 20 minutes later, she woke up. She didn't open her eyes immediately, because she was pulled out of sleep by this wet, rhythmic clacking and scraping sound, like porcelain bowls aggressively clinking against wooden chopsticks, mixed with the heavy, disgusting slurping of mouths chewing hungrily. Delilah sighed, keeping her eyes closed. She thought the crew had finally returned, but as she lay there, the annoyance started to build. Why were they eating without waking her up? And why was it so dark? She opened her eyes and squinted toward the dining table. There were about 7 men sitting on the wooden benches, hunched over the table. The camp was almost entirely dark. They hadn't bothered to light a single kerosene lamp. Delilah sat up slowly, rubbing her neck. Her voice was raspy as she called out to them, asking why they couldn't even bother to light a lamp, and demanding to know where the others were, and where Callum was. The men didn't stop eating. They didn't turn around. There was no answer, just the continuous, maddening slurping and smacking sounds that were absolutely revolting, sounding almost desperate, like starving animals tearing into a carcass with frantic, jerky movements. Getting annoyed, She muttered that they were eating like pigs and told them they should have at least waited for the rest of the crew. Still no answer, just the aggressive, wet sounds of chewing. Delilah felt a sudden, heavy pressure in the air. The temperature in the camp seemed to plummet, making the hair on her arms stand up. A sickeningly sweet, metallic smell began to waft through the humid air, masking the scent of the roasted pork. She froze. Her instincts, honed by generations of superstition, screamed at her not to move, not to walk over to that table. She just sat there on the cot, her breath trapped in her throat, watching the dark silhouettes devour the meal in the pitch black. 15 agonizing minutes passed. Then, from far down the dirt path, she heard a sound that made her heart drop into her stomach. It was a sharp, cheerful whistle, followed by the loud, booming laughter of the foreman, and the heavy, sloshing footsteps of nearly 20 men tramping through the mud. It was us. We were just returning. Delilah snapped her head back toward the dining table. It was empty. There was no one sitting on the benches. No shadows. No movement. I walked into the camp a minute later, covered in mud from head to toe, wiping sweat from my forehead. I groaned about what a total nightmare the mud had been while throwing my ruined shirt onto a post, telling Delilah the truck was finally out, and begging her to tell me she had made food because we were all starving. Delilah was pale as a sheet. She was shaking so hard the cot was rattling. She just pointed a trembling finger at the table. The guys didn't notice her panic. They were too hungry. They swarmed the table, lighting the kerosene lamps. The yellow light flooded the dining area. The bamboo lids were still perfectly in place over the bowls. One of the younger guys mentioned that it smelled a little funky, but he didn't care as he pulled the lid off the massive bowl of pork and vegetables. He grabbed a pair of chopsticks, scooped a massive bite into his mouth, and chewed. 3 seconds later, he doubled over and violently vomited onto the dirt floor. He started gagging and choking out a string of profanities, asking what the hell was in the bowl. I rushed over, grabbing the lamp and holding it over the food. The pork and vegetables were covered in a thick, grayish, iridescent slime. It looked like it had been sitting out in the blistering sun for a month. The rice was soupy, gray, and bubbling slightly, emitting a putrid, sour stench that smelled like an open grave. It was completely rotten, and as I looked at that bubbling gray mass of what used to be dinner, I noticed a tiny, perfectly clean little pebble sitting right on the edge of the wooden table, just a smooth gray river stone, and I couldn't stop wondering how it got there. My brain just entirely shut down and focused on that stupid pebble while the smell of an open grave filled the camp, but it had only been cooked 2 hours ago. The lids hadn't even been removed. The bowls were completely undisturbed. Delilah let out a choked sob, her voice completely cracking as she whispered that she had heard them. She had literally sat there and heard them eating it. I stared at the rancid, slimy food, and my mind instantly flashed back to the men in the floppy hats walking silently into the dark woods. I felt the phantom sting of the cuts on the bottom of my feet. Whatever lived out in that untouched patch of earth, it didn't want us there, and it was hungry. We didn't sleep that night. The guys tried to rationalize it, blaming the heat, blaming a bad cut of meat, but no one touched the food. They just drank water and stared into the dark until the sun came up. At first light, I walked into the foreman's tent. I didn't ask. I told him we were leaving. He threw a fit. He threatened to withhold every single penny we had earned over the last 2 weeks. He called me crazy, said I was breaking a contract over some spoiled soup. I told him he could shove the money. We packed our single duffel bag, hitched a ride on the empty logging truck heading back to the city, and didn't look back once. It took us nearly half a day just to reach the edge of the tree line, and I didn't take a full breath until the dirt road turned back to pavement. It's been decades, and yeah, we stayed poor for a long time after that. But I'm still alive. You know, the funny thing is, you see kids nowadays signing up for these remote, off-the-grid jobs, chasing that quick paycheck. They think the worst thing out there is bad Wi-Fi or a bear. They don't understand that some places on this earth haven't been touched for a reason. And for the record, to this day, if Delilah is cooking and the food smells even slightly off, I will throw the entire pot straight into the trash. I don't care how much it costs. I'm never smelling that smell again. You know that heavy, suffocating silence that settles into a house when everyone else has moved on with their lives? That's where this whole nightmare started. It was 2019. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely, entirely obsolete. I had spent my entire 20s being a stay-at-home mom, cooking, cleaning, wiping noses, helping with homework. But my husband's career had finally stabilized, and my kid was in high school. He didn't need me hovering over him anymore. He'd come home, shut his bedroom door, and that was that. My husband would veg out in front of the evening news, and I was just there, pacing the hallways of my own home like a ghost. I fell into this deep, isolating funk for months, just drifting around the living room every evening, feeling useless. So, I figured maybe getting a job would snap me out of it, bring in a little extra cash, get me out of the house, give me a purpose. Look, I'm not exactly tech savvy. I didn't go online to hunt for corporate gigs. I just hit the pavement in my neighborhood, asking around small eateries and cafes if they needed someone to wash dishes or wait tables. But my availability was completely terrible. I still had to make dinner for my family, so I could only work from about 6 in the evening until maybe 9 or 10 at night. Nobody wants to hire a 34-year-old woman for a 3-hour shift. They want young, energetic college kids who can hustle all night. I got rejected everywhere. One evening, I was riding my scooter back home, feeling utterly defeated. It was one of those oppressive, muggy nights in Saigon where the heat just sort of bakes into the asphalt and radiates back up at you, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I was completely lost in my own miserable thoughts, completely forgetting to check my fuel gauge. Right in the middle of this dusty industrial stretch, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Jesus, I thought, just my luck. I had to get off and push the heavy bike down the road, sweating through my shirt, looking for a gas station. My arms were shaking by the time I managed to push it about 100 yards. I was exhausted. I saw this long concrete bench sitting outside a closed manufacturing warehouse, just a massive wall of corrugated metal pulling the heat in, and I collapsed onto it. I was sitting there, catching my breath, pulling out my phone to swallow my pride and call my husband for a rescue. And right at that exact moment, a stray gust of wind blew a piece of paper down the sidewalk. It tumbled across the concrete and plastered itself right against my ankle. I know how it sounds. It sounds like cheap fiction, but I swear on my life, that's how it happened. I looked down, and it was a torn piece of A4 paper. Large, bold letters scrawled in black marker caught my eye. Help wanted. I hung up the phone before it even rang. I peeled the paper off my foot and squinted at it in the dim streetlights. It was incredibly brief. Seeking female unskilled labor. Ages 30 to 45. Shift, 6 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. High salary. It had a phone number at the bottom. It was like the universe had tailor-made a job listing specifically for my miserable situation. The hours were perfect. The age requirement was perfect. I saved the number immediately, called my husband to bring me a bottle of gas, and went home feeling this weird buzz of hope. The next morning, I called the number. A woman answered. She sounded middle-aged, her voice a little raspy, but polite enough. I told her I saw the flyer and fit the description. She basically interviewed me right then and there over the phone. She owned a leather ball factory, a small private operation supplying sporting goods to the wholesale markets. She said she needed someone to inflate the stitched leather casings. Simple enough. But then, out of nowhere, the conversation took a bizarre turn. She casually asked if I had ever been a nanny. I blinked, totally caught off guard. I told her no, but mentioned I had a teenager and had taken care of nieces and nephews, so I knew my way around kids, before jokingly asking if I was inflating basketballs or babysitting. She laughed, but it sounded a little tight. She assured me it was just inflating balls and claimed she only asked because former nannies tend to be gentler with their hands, before telling me I was hired and to come in tomorrow evening. Then she told me the pay. 6 million dong a month. That's roughly $250. For context, working a brutal, sweaty shift bussing tables back then would maybe net you about $150 a month, This woman was offering me nearly double the going rate for a 4.5-hour shift where I just sat on my butt. I thought I had struck gold. I showed up early the next day, around 5:45 p.m. The factory was at the end of a long, narrow alleyway, flanked by a few small mechanic shops and a makeshift iced tea stand where the neighborhood folks gathered to gossip. I parked my bike and waited outside. Almost immediately, I felt the weight of several sets of eyes on me. The women sitting on the plastic stools at the tea stand were staring dead at me, whispering behind their hands. This older woman holding a stack of lottery tickets detached herself from the group and ambled over to me. She tried to sell me a ticket, which I politely declined. Then she leaned in, her eyes darting toward the factory gate. She muttered something about me looking new and asked what I was doing sitting out there. I cheerfully told her that I was waiting to start my shift and had just got hired. The old woman's eyes went wide. She physically recoiled, her face twisting in disgust, asking if I was out of my mind going in there and if I even knew what I was getting into. Before she could finish her sentence, the heavy metal gate rattled open. The boss marched out. She pointed a finger at the lottery seller and absolutely unloaded on her, screaming at her to get the hell out of there with her nonsense and threatening to run her out of the alley if she didn't stop bothering the workers. The old woman scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and scurried away. The boss completely changed her demeanor the second she turned to me. She smiled warmly, ushered me inside, and didn't even give me a chance to introduce myself to the dozen or so workers sweating over sewing machines in the main hall. She led me straight to the back of the warehouse, into a private room. It was jarringly out of place. The rest of the factory was loud, hot, and smelled of machine oil and sweat. But this room, it was spacious, spotless, and freezing cold. Wait, not just cold, it was artificially frigid, like walking into a meat locker. An air conditioning unit was humming quietly in the corner. There was a flat-screen TV on the wall, a small refrigerator, and, strangest of all, a fully made, comfortable-looking bed. In the center of the room was an air compressor and a massive pile of flattened leather balls. She pointed to the compressor and explained the deal. Workers would drop off the stitched casings, and my job was to hook them to the nozzle, inflate them, and toss them in the outgoing bin. She added that if I ran out of work, I could just hang out, watch TV, eat the fruit in the fridge, or, she patted the mattress, take a nap and sleep as long as I wanted, promising she'd wake me if she needed me. I was dumbfounded. I was getting paid premium wages to exist in an air-conditioned sanctuary. For the first 3 days, it was a breeze. I'd inflate maybe 50 balls a night, which took about 30 minutes. The rest of the time, I just watched soap operas and enjoyed the solitude. But by the 4th day, the atmosphere in that room started to shift. The work volume plummeted. I had maybe 20 balls to inflate the entire shift. The boredom became agonizing. The humming of the AC unit started to sound like a low, droning white noise that pressed against my eardrums. The room always smelled faintly of old leather, but now there was an undercurrent of something else, something sweet and cloying, like rotting candy and stale incense. I was lying on the bed, fighting off the heavy, unnatural drowsiness that seemed to permeate the room when I glanced at the door. It was an aluminum frame with frosted glass panes. You couldn't see details through it, just blurry shapes and light. If one of the adult workers walked by, you'd see a dark smudge taking up the top half of the glass. But as I stared at the door, I saw a shadow standing perfectly still. It was only about 3.5 feet tall. It was just a small, round head and narrow shoulders, lingering right at the bottom edge of the glass. It looked like someone was standing on their tiptoes, trying to peek in. I got off the bed, opened the door, and looked out. The hallway was completely empty. I hadn't seen a single child in this factory since I started. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself the fluorescent lights were playing tricks on me. Just my mind trying to make sense of blurry shadows. I locked the door, climbed back into bed, and let the bone-deep exhaustion pull me under. That was the night the dream started. In the dream, I was still in the factory room, but I wasn't a laborer anymore. I was a nanny. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a small bowl of rice, feeding a little boy. He looked about 4 years old. He was pale, with a short buzz cut and these incredibly dark, almost glassy eyes. He knew my name. "Brooke," he whined in that high-pitched, needy voice kids have. "I want more food, Brooke." I spoon-fed him, wiped his mouth, bathed him. It felt so incredibly real, the weight of him on my lap, the coldness of his skin. When I finally jolted awake, my shift was entirely over. I had slept for over 3 hours. I stumbled out of the room, feeling groggy and embarrassed, apologizing profusely to the boss. But she didn't care. In fact, her eyes lit up. She asked, her voice tight with an eager, almost desperate curiosity, if I had dreamed and what it was about. I nervously laughed it off, telling her I had a weird dream about being a nanny to a little boy. A wave of profound relief washed over her face. She whispered that it was very good, telling me to just go home, and that she'd see me tomorrow. I honestly had no earthly idea what the hell she was going on about. Why was she so thrilled that I was sleeping on her dime? But honestly, I was too groggy and weirded out to care. I just nodded, grabbed my stuff, and got the hell out of there. All I wanted was to go home. Over the next week, the dreams escalated. They stopped being simple babysitting scenarios and turned into grueling, exhausting chores. The boy became a tyrant. He would throw tantrums, demanding I carry him on my back, screaming in my ear, "My mom pays you to take care of me," he would yell, digging his little fingers into my shoulders. "You have to do what I say." I would wake up from these naps feeling physically drained, my muscles aching as if I had actually been carrying a 40-pound weight for hours. I started dreading that room. I dreaded the AC humming. I dreaded the softness of that mattress. But the money kept me coming back. I kept telling myself it was just psychological stress, until the night the dream followed me home. It was maybe 2 weeks into the job. I was asleep in my own house, in my own bed, next to my husband. In the nightmare, the little boy appeared in my bedroom. He grabbed my wrist with hands that felt like absolute ice. "Who said you could leave?" he snarled, his face contorting into something hateful. "You sleep in my room. You feed me. Come back to my house." He yanked my arm, dragging me out of the bedroom. I was terrified, struggling against him, but his grip was like a steel vice. Suddenly, I snapped awake. I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the pitch-black darkness of my living room, my arm still outstretched, as if someone was pulling it. The chill of the tile floor seeped into my bare feet. Lord have mercy. My heart almost stopped. The sheer panic of waking up mid-stride, in the exact spot the dream creature had dragged me to, sent a wave of nausea over me. That wasn't just stress. Something had latched onto me. The next evening, I went to work with every intention of quitting. I showed up 20 minutes early, planning to drop the bomb before my shift even started. The main factory floor was relatively quiet, workers just starting to trickle in. I walked toward my isolated room, but stopped dead in my tracks. The door was closed, but the walls were thin. I heard someone inside. It was my boss. She was crying. Not a gentle weeping, but a wretched guttural sobbing that sounded like it was tearing her throat apart. I crept closer, pressing my ear near the frosted glass. "Are you happy with Brooke, baby?" She was whispering through her tears. "Mommy is paying her to stay with you. You like her, right? Don't leave Mommy. Please don't go. Stay here. Play with Brooke. She'll take care of you forever." My stomach plummeted. I shifted slightly, looking through the narrow gap between the door frame and the wall. The boss was sitting on the edge of my bed. Next to her was a child-sized teddy bear. It had never been in the room before. She was stroking its head as if it were a living thing, and in her other hand, she held 3 sticks of burning incense. The thick, heavy scent of sandalwood was seeping under the door, filling my lungs. Suddenly, she stood up. I scrambled back, dropping onto a plastic chair nearby just as she threw the door open. We locked eyes. She was clutching the bear to her chest, the incense smoking in her hand, her face completely ruined by tears. She choked out that I was early, quickly wiping her face and shoving the bear behind her back. before ordering me to go inside and work. She practically forced me into the room and slammed the door shut behind me. The smell of incense was overpowering. It was suffocating. I sat in the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were no leather balls to inflate. Nothing. Just the hum of the AC and the lingering smoke. I knew what this was now. This wasn't a job. This was an offering. She was serving me up as a plaything for her dead child's ghost, keeping his spirit trapped in this room, out of pure, selfish grief. I resolved to stay awake. I stared at the TV screen, refusing to blink, refusing to lie on that bed. An hour passed. The silence in the room began to feel incredibly heavy, pressing down on my chest. The edges of my vision started to blur. I tried to stand up, to walk around, but my limbs felt like they were filled with wet cement. Then, over the droning of the air conditioner, I heard this sharp, distinct child's giggle, a sinister little hee-hee that seemed to originate right from the completely empty corner of the room, freezing the blood in my veins. I froze. I couldn't move. I was slipping into sleep paralysis, completely awake but utterly trapped in my own body. The room grew unnaturally cold. A heavy weight crawled onto the bed behind me. I couldn't turn my head. I could only feel the mattress sink. Then, tiny freezing hands wrapped around my neck. He didn't look like a normal boy anymore. His face crept into my peripheral vision. The skin was too smooth, the eyes wide and unblinking, like a porcelain doll animated by something malicious. "Don't leave," he shrieked, his voice vibrating right into my skull. "You belong to me. Mom bought you for me." He started thrashing, digging his fingernails into my arms, biting at my shoulders. It was a silent, suffocating terror. I tried to scream, to thrash, but I was entirely paralyzed. Holy fucking shit! The pain in my arms was searing, absolute agony. It felt like an eternity, drowning in this cold, violent darkness with this unnatural thing tearing at me. With one massive surge of sheer adrenaline, I finally jolted awake, gasping for air. Falling out of the chair and hitting the hard floor, I scrambled to my feet. I looked down at my arms. There were angry red scratch marks dragging down my forearms. Real, physical scratches. I completely lost it. I threw the door open and sprinted out into the main hall. The boss was pacing near the entrance. When she saw me, she gripped my arm surprisingly tight, pleading to know what was wrong and why I was leaving. I shoved her back and screamed that I was done, that her kid was haunting me and tearing me apart. She burst into fresh tears, falling to her knees and clinging to my pants, hysterically begging me to stay, insisting he was a good boy who died unjustly and was just lonely, even offering to pay me 10 million dong, over $400 a month, just to sleep there and let him play with me. It was the most horrifying, pathetic thing I had ever seen. A mother perfectly willing to sacrifice another human being's sanity just to keep a phantom of her child around. The commotion drew the neighbors. The locals from the tea stand marched over. One of the women shouted at her to let me go, calling her a crazy old bat and yelling that she had been raising that ghost for years, chasing off every worker in the district, and that she needed to let the boy move on. The boss let go of me to yell back at them, and that was my chance. I bolted to my scooter, kicked it into gear, and sped out of that alley without looking back. I left half a month's wages behind and didn't care one bit. When I finally made it home, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the front door. I didn't say a single word to my husband or my kid. I mean, how the hell do you even sit your family down and explain that you were almost dragged to the other side by a toddler's ghost because you wanted a part-time job? I went out the very next morning and bought all this superstitious crap. Thorny cactus pots, bagua mirrors, these incredibly foul-smelling mulberry branches, and I frantically nailed them over every single doorway and window in the house. But it didn't bring me any peace. There is no magical happy ending where you just brush it off and move on. I haven't slept a full night since. Every single time our AC compressor kicks on, that low, vibrating hum, my chest just immediately seizes up and my forearms start burning, right in the exact spots where those freezing little fingernails dug into my skin. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is the nights when my husband works late. I can't just lie there in the dark. I physically can't. I have to take this thick canvas belt, and I strap my own wrist tightly to the heavy oak bed frame. I have to, because every time I close my eyes, I'm absolutely paralyzed by the thought, what if I don't tie myself down, and I wake up sleepwalking again? What if this time, I don't wake up in my own living room, but I wake up locked inside that freezing meat locker of a room, and I hear that sick little giggle right next to my ear? I can't.